3 fuel depots, 72 hours, 40% of Crimea's forward military fuel capacity, gone. May 28, 2026. Somewhere over the Black Sea coastline, a Ukrainian mid-range drone flies at 40 meters altitude, hugging the terrain, invisible to Russian radar. Below it, a converted civilian fuel terminal on the T-2209 highway corridor holds 60,000 liters of diesel designated for Russian armored units pushing south from Simferopol. The Russian logistics planners who positioned that depot thought they were safe. They thought mid-range UAVs from mainland Ukraine couldn't reach them. They were wrong. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear is how Ukrainian military planners dismantled Russia's entire southern Crimean fuel network in under 3 days, using domestically produced drones, electronic intelligence gaps, and a precision sequencing strategy that left Russian armored commanders begging for emergency airlifts. This isn't a story about luck. It's about preparation, patience, and the kind of asymmetric warfare Russia still doesn't know how to counter. Stay with this, because what unfolds over the next 72 hours doesn't just strand Russian tanks. It reveals something fundamental about how Ukraine is winning this war in ways that never make the front pages. By late spring 2026, Russia's hold on Crimea had become a logistics nightmare dressed up as a military stronghold. Storm Shadow cruise missiles, British-supplied, Ukrainian-operated, had spent the previous 6 months systematically dismantling Black Sea Fleet infrastructure. The Sevastopol naval base absorbed 3 confirmed strikes between February and April. The Feodosia fuel pier, once a critical resupply node, was rendered non-operational after a February 14th strike package that Ukrainian General Staff later described as a coordinated denial operation. Russia was losing infrastructure faster than it could repair it. But the Black Sea Fleet strikes, as damaging as they were, only addressed the maritime logistics chain. Russian ground forces in southern Crimea, primarily elements of the 22nd Army Corps, reinforced with newly arrived units from Russia's Eastern Military District, were drawing fuel from a separate terrestrial network. 3 dispersed staging depots, all former civilian fuel terminals, all operating along or near the T-2209 highway corridor connecting Simferopol to the southern coast. Russian military planners had deliberately chosen civilian infrastructure because it was harder to target without generating international headlines. They had also calculated that the distance from Ukrainian-controlled territory made mid-range UAV strikes impractical. The nearest Ukrainian launch positions in Zaporizhzhia Oblast were over 300 kilometers away. Standard mid-range drones Russia had observed Ukraine deploying maxed out at around 250 kilometers effective range. On paper, the depots were safe. Ukrainian military planners didn't care about the paper. Which weapon system proved decisive in this operation? Was it A, the mid-range UAV strike packages, B, the FPV drone interdiction screen on the M18 highway, or C, the electronic intelligence that identified the radar gaps? Think about it. We'll give you the answer before this is over. The General Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, had been mapping Crimean logistics infrastructure for months before the May 2026 strike series. This wasn't reactive intelligence. It was systematic, patient reconnaissance conducted through multiple collection streams simultaneously. Satellite imagery from commercial providers, cross-referenced with Ukrainian military reconnaissance satellites, had tracked fuel tanker movements along the T-2209 corridor since the previous autumn. Drone reconnaissance sorties, flown by small, low-observable UAVs at night, had physically confirmed depot locations, storage capacity estimates, and, critically, the absence of meaningful air defense coverage at each site. I spent considerable time going through the available intelligence picture before this video, and one detail kept standing out. The Russian decision to leave these depots essentially undefended wasn't negligence. It was a calculated bet. Russian air defense assets in Crimea, primarily Tor M2 and Pantsir S-1 systems, were concentrated around Sevastopol, Saki Air Base, and the Kerch Bridge corridor. Dispersing them to cover every fuel terminal along the T-2209 would have degraded coverage at the sites Russian planners considered strategically irreplaceable. They made a prioritization call. Ukraine exploited it. The electronic intelligence picture was equally critical. Ukrainian ELINT assets, a combination of ground-based receivers positioned along the contact line and airborne collection platforms, had been mapping Russian radar coverage patterns across southern Crimea for the better part of 2 years. By May 2026, Ukrainian analysts had identified what they described internally as a low-altitude corridor along a specific terrain feature running roughly parallel to the T-2209's northern approach. The corridor wasn't a complete radar blind spot. It was something more subtle, a zone where terrain masking reduced effective radar detection altitude to below 60 meters for a specific category of radar cross-section. Ukrainian domestically produced mid-range UAVs, flying at 40 to 50 meters in a specific flight profile, would appear as noise, or not appear at all, to Russian radar operators monitoring that sector. The corridor was narrow. The flight profile was demanding. The margin for error was measured in meters of altitude and seconds of timing. The first strike package launched on the night of May 27th to 28th, 2026. 3 Ukrainian mid-range UAVs departed from a forward staging location in Zaporizhzhia Oblast at 11:17 p.m. The exact launch coordinates remain classified, but Ukrainian sources confirmed the aircraft flew a pre-programmed route that exploited the identified radar corridor for approximately 220 kilometers of the total flight. The drones, domestically produced systems that Ukrainian defense industry sources described as an evolution of earlier strike UAV programs, carried thermobaric and incendiary warhead combinations optimized for fuel storage targets. Each drone carried a payload in the range of 40 to 60 kilograms. Against a civilian fuel terminal holding tens of thousands of liters of petroleum products, that was more than sufficient. The route planning took the 3 drones on divergent approach paths that converged on the target from 3 different compass bearings. This wasn't accidental. Ukrainian planners had studied Russian air defense response patterns across dozens of previous strike operations and identified a consistent pattern. When a single inbound track appeared, radar operators would alert Pantsir batteries positioned at Saki. Response time from alert to engagement ready was approximately 4 minutes. By flying 3 drones on converging approach paths offset by 8 minutes each, Ukrainian planners calculated that even if the first drone was detected and engaged, the second and third would arrive in the gap between the first alert and a re-queued engagement solution. At 3:22 a.m. on May 28th, the first Ukrainian UAV crossed the depot perimeter at the northernmost T-2209 staging site, designated Depot Alpha in Ukrainian operational planning. The drone's terminal guidance system locked onto thermal signatures from the fuel storage tanks, large metal containers that radiate heat differentially from the surrounding terrain even at night. The warhead detonated against the primary storage berm. What happened next was visible 40 kilometers away. The initial detonation ruptured 2 primary storage tanks. Diesel fuel, pressurized by the concussive wave, sprayed across adjacent infrastructure. A secondary ignition sequence, the thermobaric component of the warhead creating an expanding combustion envelope, caught the fuel vapor cloud that had formed above the ruptured tanks. The resulting fireball was estimated by Ukrainian drone reconnaissance imagery at approximately 60 meters in diameter. The secondary explosion, when the remaining intact tanks failed from thermal stress 3 minutes later, produced a pressure wave that shattered windows in a village 2 kilometers from the depot perimeter. Russian emergency responders from the nearest fire station in Simferopol reached the site at approximately 4:45 a.m. By that point, Depot Alpha was not a structure to be saved. It was a crater surrounded by burning infrastructure. Intercepted Russian military communications from that morning, later published by Ukrainian intelligence as part of their Operational Transparency Initiative, showed a logistics officer from the 22nd Army Corps attempting to reach his superior at 4:52 a.m. to report the loss. The response: "Confirm it was a drone. We will submit a report. Do not use radio for damage assessments." Standard Russian operational security procedure, and completely useless at stopping what was already in motion. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the version filtered through official press releases, but the tactical reality that commanders on both sides are studying right now. Here's what's most surprising about this operation, and it took time to fully appreciate. The 72-hour spacing between strikes wasn't a limitation. It was a weapon. Ukrainian planners deliberately chose not to hit all 3 depots at once. They wanted Russian logistics commanders to know the first depot had been hit. They wanted those commanders making decisions under uncertainty. Do you redistribute fuel stocks to compensate? Do you request emergency resupply? Do you move tanker convoys to avoid the corridor? Every decision Russian logistics officers made in the hours after the first strike would create new vulnerabilities. The 72-hour window was designed to be long enough for Russian responses to crystallize, and short enough that those responses couldn't be fully implemented before the second strike. This is the part of the operation that doesn't get discussed enough. This wasn't just a strike operation. It was a decision-forcing sequence. May 29th. The morning after Depot Alpha's destruction, Russian logistics commanders in Crimea were dealing with 2 simultaneous pressures. First, the immediate fuel shortfall from the loss of Depot Alpha, estimated by Ukrainian intelligence at approximately 15,000 liters of diesel that would have serviced armored unit rotations over the following week. Second, uncertainty about whether depots Bravo and Charlie along the T-2209 corridor were also targeted. Russian commanders did what commanders under pressure typically do. They tried to hedge every bet at once. Fuel stocks at Depot Bravo were partially redistributed to armored unit holding areas. Additional security personnel were dispatched to Depot Charlie. Infantry with shoulder-fired air defense systems, Igla-S manpads, deployed around the perimeter. A request went through the Southern Military District logistics chain for emergency fuel resupply from the mainland. The resupply request called for tanker trucks via the M18 highway from Melitopol. The M18 request was the mistake Ukrainian planners had anticipated. The second strike package was already in preparation. But what Ukrainian tactical planners saw unfolding on the M18 highway approach to Crimea was something they hadn't scripted, an opportunity that exceeded the original operational design. Ukrainian forces in Zaporizhzhia Oblast maintained persistent FPV drone coverage over the M18 highway approach to the Crimean Isthmus. This wasn't coincidental. The M18 was the primary land resupply route for any Russian emergency logistics response to Crimea, a fact Ukrainian planners had incorporated into operational planning months before the fuel depot strikes were authorized. FPV drone teams, operating from concealed positions in Ukrainian-controlled territory, had standing orders to engage any Russian military logistics convoys on the M18 approach with priority authorization. At 2:15 p.m. on May 29th, Ukrainian reconnaissance drone operators identified a column of 5 Russian fuel tanker trucks moving southbound on the M18, escorted by 2 BTR-82A armored personnel carriers. The column was moving at approximately 60 kilometers per hour, a speed that suggested the Russian escort commander understood he was in a contested zone and wanted to minimize exposure time. It wasn't fast enough. Put yourself in the position of the Ukrainian FPV drone operator watching that column approach. You have a $500 drone. You have a column of vehicles worth collectively several $1 million. You have a standing engagement authorization. And you know that every liter of fuel in those tanker trucks, if it reaches southern Crimea, partially compensates for what Ukraine's mid-range UAVs destroyed 24 hours earlier. The math isn't complicated. The engagement began at 2:23 p.m. Ukrainian sources later confirmed that 8 FPV drones were committed in 2 waves of 4. The first wave targeted the lead BTR-82A and the second tanker truck, a sequencing designed to halt the column and cut off the trailing vehicles. The lead BTR took a direct impact on the engine deck from the first FPV drone and lost mobility. The second tanker detonated when an FPV carrying a shaped charge penetrated the tank compartment. The explosion of a fully loaded fuel tanker produces a concussive and thermal effect that extends well beyond the vehicle itself. The third tanker in column, positioned 30 meters behind the second, sustained significant thermal damage that rendered it non-operational without a direct strike. The Russian escort commander in the trailing BTR made the correct tactical decision. He reversed and withdrew north. He got out. But of the 5 tanker trucks, 3 were destroyed outright, and 1 was abandoned by its crew and later assessed as non-recoverable. Only 1 tanker from the emergency resupply convoy reached its destination. The fuel shortfall in southern Crimea was not being solved. It was getting worse. Here's our read on this, and it's worth saying directly. The decision by Russian logistics commanders to route emergency resupply through the M18 without helicopter escort or electronic warfare support to suppress the Ukrainian FPV threat was a fundamental professional failure. Russian military doctrine recognizes contested logistics corridors as requiring combined arms protection. The 22nd Army Corps logistics staff had access to K-52 helicopters based at Saki. They had Krasuka electronic warfare systems that could have degraded Ukrainian FPV communications in the corridor. They used neither. They sent fuel trucks with 2 BTRs and hoped for the best. Against an opponent that had been intercepting Russian logistics for 3 years, hope is not a planning tool. If you believe tactical competence, not equipment, not numbers, determines outcomes in modern warfare, type Steelfront in the comments right now. The second Ukrainian mid-range UAV strike launched in the early hours of May 30th, 2026. The target was Depot Bravo, the central staging site along the T-2209 corridor. Russian security forces had been dispatched to the depot following the Depot Alpha strike, but the additional personnel were infantry with Igla-S manpads, systems designed for engagement envelopes above 500 meters altitude against slower-moving aircraft. Against a mid-range UAV flying at 40 meters in a terminal dive profile, an Igla-S positioned on the depot perimeter needs a radar cueing system to acquire the target in time. The Igla teams at Depot Bravo had no radar cueing. They had human observers. At 2:47 a.m., the Ukrainian UAV crossed the outer perimeter of Depot Bravo. One of the Igla teams reportedly heard the drone and attempted to acquire it visually. By the time an operator had shouldered the launcher and attempted acquisition, the UAV was 40 seconds from impact. The Igla missed. The drone did not. Depot Bravo was structurally different from Depot Alpha. It had been a civilian liquid petroleum gas terminal before conversion for military use, and its storage infrastructure included above-ground pipeline connections between storage tanks. The Ukrainian warhead struck the primary storage tank directly, but the secondary explosion sequence followed the pipeline infrastructure, producing a chain of detonations that progressed across the facility for nearly 4 minutes. Ukrainian reconnaissance drone footage, reviewed by open-source analysts after Ukrainian intelligence released it, showed the explosion sequence moving like a burning fuse from the primary tank to the junction manifold to 3 secondary tanks along the eastern perimeter. The resulting fire burned for 6 hours before Russian emergency services could establish a containment perimeter. Satellite imagery analysis published by independent OSINT investigators confirmed the total destruction of Depot Bravo's storage capacity. Pre-strike imagery had estimated the site held approximately 20,000 liters of military-grade diesel. Post-strike imagery showed complete structural collapse of all storage infrastructure. 2 depots, 2 strikes, approximately 35,000 liters of forward military fuel capacity gone, and Depot Charlie still standing. But the Russian commanders responsible for it now knew with certainty that Ukrainian forces had their coordinates, their approach corridors, and the capability to hit them whenever they chose. The intercepted communications from the 22nd Army Corps Logistics Network over May 30th make for extraordinary reading. Ukrainian intelligence released a translated summary 3 days after the operation concluded. The logistics commander responsible for Depot Charlie was simultaneously fielding requests from armored unit commanders demanding fuel priority while receiving no confirmation of incoming emergency resupply. One intercepted exchange, time-stamped at 11:30 a.m. on May 30th, shows a colonel commanding a combined arms regiment asking whether he should begin fuel rationing for armored vehicles. The logistics officer's response: implement Stage 1 fuel economy protocols immediately, priority to mobility maintenance only, no offensive fuel allocations until further notice. Stage 1 fuel economy protocols represent a 40% reduction in fuel allocation from standard operational rates. Russian armored units in southern Crimea were already rationing fuel before the third and final strike. Most people looking at this situation from outside would assume hitting the third depot at this point was straightforward. The Russian defenses had failed twice. The logistics network was already broken. Why not execute immediately? Here's the part that doesn't make obvious sense on the surface. Ukrainian planners chose to wait. The third strike launched 47 hours after the second, not because of capability constraints, but because the wait itself was inflicting costs. Every hour that Depot Charlie remained intact but threatened was an hour that Russian armored commanders had to make decisions under uncertainty. Do they move fuel from Charlie to unit holding areas, dispersing it and making it harder to consolidate for offensive operations? Do they request helicopter resupply, which would consume aviation assets Russia desperately needs elsewhere? Do they accept the fuel rationing and hold position, which means Russian armored units sitting in place, consuming maintenance fuel without conducting the rotational movements that keep armored forces combat ready? Any of these choices degraded Russian offensive capacity in southern Crimea. The threat of the third strike was, in some ways, as operationally valuable as the strike itself. What would NATO have done differently in Ukraine's position? Would they have compressed the timeline and hit all 3 depots in one night? Or would they have used the same deliberate sequencing that Ukrainian planners chose? Comment your analysis. These are exactly the kinds of doctrinal questions that military academies will be debating for years. The third and final strike launched on the night of May 31st to June 1st, 2026. By this point, Russian air defense commanders in Crimea had received emergency reinforcement orders. 2 additional Tor M2 systems were en route from mainland Russia, but they hadn't arrived. The Panzer S-1 systems already in Crimea had been repositioned in the 48 hours since the Depot Alpha strike, but that repositioning was based on trajectory data from the first 2 strikes. Ukrainian operators had fed false pattern information through those first 2 strikes. The approach corridors used for Alpha and Bravo were slightly different from each other in ways that, when analyzed by Russian radar analysts, suggested a particular preferred approach sector. The third strike used a completely different corridor. This detail, revealed in a Ukrainian military intelligence briefing published in early June 2026, is worth sitting with. The operational planners had designed all 3 strikes as an integrated deception package, not just a sequential strike operation. The first 2 strikes were partly intended to establish Russian assumptions about Ukrainian approach preferences. The third strike was designed to exploit those assumptions. At 1:11 a.m. on June 1st, the Ukrainian UAV assigned to Depot Charlie crossed the target perimeter on an approach vector that Russian repositioned air defense systems were not oriented to cover. The detonation sequence at Depot Charlie was similar to Depot Bravo, a primary strike on storage infrastructure, followed by secondary explosions from fuel vapor ignition. Ukrainian drone reconnaissance footage showed the depot burning for several hours. Independent satellite imagery, published by commercial providers on June 2nd, confirmed total destruction of storage capacity. Depot Charlie was assessed as holding approximately 25,000 liters at time of strike. 3 depots. 3 strikes, approximately 60,000 liters of forward military fuel capacity gone, plus the additional loss of the M18 resupply convoy, 3 tanker trucks and their cargoes. Total estimated Russian military fuel loss in the 72-hour operation, somewhere between 65 and 75,000 liters of military-grade diesel and associated petroleum products. The operational impact was immediate and documented. Within 96 hours of the first strike, by the morning of June 1st, Ukrainian signals intelligence was detecting communications from Russian armored unit commanders in southern Crimea reporting Stage 2 fuel economy protocol implementation. Stage 2 is a 60% reduction from standard operational rates. At Stage 2, Russian armored vehicles are in position hold status. Offensive maneuver operations are not feasible. Even defensive repositioning becomes constrained by fuel availability calculations. The 22nd Army Corps request for emergency fuel resupply by airlift, submitted through Southern Military District Logistics Command on June 1st and later obtained by Ukrainian intelligence, asked for 40,000 liters of diesel to be delivered by Mi-26 heavy transport helicopter within 48 hours. The request acknowledged that available ground resupply routes were under persistent UAV interdiction threat, a direct reference to the M18 FPV engagement, and that rail resupply through the Kerch Bridge corridor was operating at reduced capacity following previous Ukrainian strikes on the rail infrastructure. The helicopter resupply would require diverting Mi-26 assets from other logistics missions, consuming aviation fuel for the transport operation, and accepting the risk that the Mi-26 themselves could be engaged by Ukrainian air defense assets or long-range drones during the approach to Crimea. Russian Southern Military District Command approved a partial resupply, 20,000 liters, delivered in stages over 4 days rather than the 48-hour window requested. Insufficient to restore Stage 1 fuel allocation rates, let alone return to standard operational rates. The armor in southern Crimea remained constrained. One detail that stuck with me while going through the post-strike intelligence picture: the Russian logistics system that failed here wasn't badly designed. It failed because Ukrainian planners had spent months mapping exactly how it worked and exactly where its redundancy gaps were. The T-2209 depots were vulnerable because Russian planners had made a series of individually reasonable decisions. Concentrate air defense at high-value fixed infrastructure, use civilian facilities for secondary logistics nodes, rely on distance as a protective factor for sites beyond assumed mid-range UAV range, and those individually reasonable decisions had combined into a systemic vulnerability that Ukrainian intelligence had identified and studied for months before the first drone launched. Here's the controversial take, and we'll stand behind it. The Russian military's fundamental problem in this war isn't equipment quality or personnel motivation or strategic leadership, though all 3 are genuine issues. It's institutional epistemology. Russian military planners consistently make decisions based on what they believe Ukraine can do, rather than systematically testing those beliefs against what Ukraine has demonstrated it can do. The mid-range UAV strikes on the T-2209 depots were possible because Ukrainian defense industry had extended effective strike range beyond what Russian planners had modeled. The FPV interdiction of the M18 resupply convoy worked because Russian logistics planners hadn't updated their threat models to account for the density of Ukrainian FPV coverage along contested approach routes. These weren't failures of intelligence collection. They were failures of intelligence integration. The system was collecting information about Ukrainian capabilities, but not translating it into updated planning assumptions fast enough to matter. The Ukrainian side demonstrated the opposite tendency throughout this operation. Every element of the strike package, the multi-corridor approach deception, the timing of the 72-hour window, the pre-positioning of FPV assets on the M18, the warhead selection optimized for fuel storage, reflected a planning team that had studied Russian responses to previous operations and built countermeasures to anticipated Russian countermeasures before the first drone launched. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine designs entire operational sequences around how the adversary will react to those weapons. Real tactics, real consequences, steel front. The broader strategic picture became clearer in the weeks following the strikes. Ukrainian General Staff reporting, published on June 5th, assessed that Russian armored offensive capacity in southern Crimea had been reduced by approximately 30% as a direct result of the fuel shortfall created by the depot strikes and the M18 interdiction. The assessment noted that Russian units had been unable to conduct the routine armored vehicle rotations and maintenance operations that sustain mechanized force readiness. Several tank units were assessed as having reduced mobility due to deferred maintenance made necessary by fuel rationing. The operational picture from mid-June 2026 shows Russian forces in southern Crimea in a defensive consolidation posture that contrasts sharply with the forward-leaning positioning those forces had maintained through the first quarter of the year. Ukrainian intelligence assessments attribute this shift partly to the fuel logistics disruption created by the T-2209 operation. The depots haven't been rebuilt. The civilian infrastructure Russia converted for military use can't be restored to operational status without a rebuilding process that takes months, and that would simply put the rebuilt facilities back on the target list. Here's the question worth sitting with. Could Russia have prevented this? The answer is genuinely complicated. With sufficient air defense coverage dispersed across every logistics node in Crimea, possibly, but that would require Russia to deploy air defense assets at a density that's not achievable given simultaneous demands from the Black Sea Fleet perimeter, the Kerch Bridge corridor, the Saki airbase complex, and the Sevastopol naval infrastructure. Ukraine's strike strategy is designed to force exactly this kind of impossible prioritization problem. Russian commanders can protect their most critical nodes, or they can try to protect everything. They can't do both. Will Russia find a way to rebuild Crimean logistics resilience? Comment yes or no, because the answer depends on whether you believe Russia can learn from systematic operational failures faster than Ukraine can identify and exploit new vulnerabilities. That's the central question of this entire war. Now for the answer to the question we posed earlier, which weapon system proved most decisive in the T-2209 operation? The answer is A, the mid-range UAV strike packages. But here's the important qualifier, not because the other elements were less important, but because the mid-range UAV capability was the enabling condition that made everything else possible. Without the ability to reach the T-2209 depots from mainland Ukraine, there's no strike operation. There's no M18 convoy attempting emergency resupply. There's no FPV interdiction opportunity. The mid-range drone capability created the crisis that then activated every other element of the Ukrainian operational response. The FPV component destroyed more hardware value per dollar spent. The ELINT exploitation was more sophisticated in technical terms. But the mid-range UAVs were the key that opened the operation. The tactical lessons here are worth stating directly. First, vulnerability mapping matters as much as strike capability. Ukraine had mapped the T-2209 logistics network for months before striking it. The intelligence investment preceded the kinetic investment. Second, timing can be weaponized independently of kinetic action. The 72-hour window between strikes was designed to force Russian decision-making under uncertainty, and it worked. Third, deception has to be integrated into strike planning from the start, not added afterward. The approach corridor deception that preceded the Depot Charlie strike was built into the operational design from the beginning, not improvised in response to Russian air defense repositioning. 3 questions worth taking into the comments. Was the decision to space the strikes 72 hours apart the right call, or would simultaneous strikes have been more effective by preventing Russian redistribution of fuel stocks? Could Russia have protected the T-2209 corridor if they had identified the Eland gap that Ukraine exploited? And thinking about your own analysis, what would you have done differently in the Ukrainian operational planning process? Subscribe to Steelfront, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The T-2209 corridor is quiet now. The 3 sites where depots Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie once held 60,000 liters of fuel are crater fields and burned infrastructure. Russian armored commanders in southern Crimea are filing fuel allocation requests that come back partially approved. The wrecked tanker trucks on the M18 have been pushed to the road's edge. And somewhere in Ukrainian-controlled territory, mid-range UAV operators are studying the next set of targeting packages, the next logistics network, the next assumption that Russia is betting its operational capacity on. Modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. Stay vigilant.